Okay, so welcome everybody. So today we are very happy to have Florian Ederer from BU who will present digital killer acquisition, and Merih Sevilir will discuss the paper. So Florian, the floor is yours. You have 40 minutes.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to present this work. Let me share my screen, and I hope you can all see it now. This is a joint work with Regina Seibel, who's at University of Toronto, and my colleague here at BU Questrom, Tim Simcoe. And this paper comes out of a long history of work that I started with Song Ma and Colleen Cunningham on killer acquisitions. And every time I presented that paper, which some of you might be familiar with, which was on pharmaceutical innovation, everybody always asks, well, it's nice that you document this type of stuff in pharmaceuticals, but the industry we're really interested in is what's happening with all of these tech acquisitions. And so it took me quite some time because it's hard to follow up a big hit with another potential big hit. But I think we've found some interesting results here, which I'm very excited to share with you today. And I should caveat all of this that this is very preliminary work, and so any of your comments, which you should feel free to interrupt me, I extremely appreciate it at this stage. So why are we focusing on this? Well, this is an audience that is very familiar with the problem. This is a graph that I constructed in some work with Bruno Pellegrino, where we, in the graph, basically document that for VC-funded startups, so these are particular types of startups, the predominant way of exiting used to be initial public offerings, but that has very much switched to acquisitions now. And for those of you who are also not just in the entrepreneurship innovation space, but maybe also are in the antitrust and competition policy space, you might be familiar with a lot of debates about whether this change in the exit strategy has also led to less dynamic and less competitive product markets. One thing that has been particularly raising some eyebrows is that of these many acquisitions, so you see that there's about almost 1,000 in 2019, a sizable proportion has been done by a particular set of firms in the tech industry. And these are Google, Apple, Facebook, Amazon, Microsoft. They're collectively named GAFAM. And then we added 3 other ones that have been also very, very active in this space in Cisco, Intel, and Qualcomm. And of course, you can see already that this paper has been knocking around, at least the project has been knocking around. The paper is very fresh, but the project has been knocking around. You might at this stage now include other potential acquirers like NVIDIA and so on. And we're working on that, but that's still a little bit stuff in progress. But we are basically interested in what is the impact of all of these acquisitions by this particular set of acquirers. Now, what does this death of the IPO mean for innovation? There's various theories that are out there. There's, of course, the very, very influential work of Thies, Gans et al., and Aurora and Fosfori and others that essentially says, well, this is a very efficient market for technology where startups essentially get a big platform here that allows them to enhance their innovation, that allows them to market the innovation to a much larger set of consumers. On the other hand, and I am really just very broadly here talking about this, is there are these innovation theories and evidence of harm. Most of this, I should emphasize, is mostly theories. So situations where acquisitions of dominant firms, of small startups can have negative impact on innovation. I should also mention that this has been studied a little bit before in the antitrust literature. So some of the work that Phillips and Stanov have done actually pointed more towards a pro-competitive effect in that it created more innovation and it created more dynamic stuff. But on the antitrust side, really what we've seen mostly is theories and a little bit of evidence from specific industries indicating that these types of startup acquisitions actually have a negative impact on innovation and on competition. Why is this of policy relevance? Well, there's a tremendous amount of additional regulatory scrutiny and antitrust action specifically against these large tech acquirers by the DOJ, by the FTC, the European Competition Commission, the Commission for Markets, the Competition Markets Authority in the United Kingdom. The 2023 merger guidelines specifically address this issue in Guideline 6 of nascent acquisitions. And the Digital Markets Act in the European Union also requires notification. So it's natural to ask specifically, what is the impact of these acquisitions by the large tech acquirers? So what we're going to do in this paper is a very, very first and I'd say very preliminary step, which is to look at essentially event studies of large tech firm acquisitions using patent data. What I'm going to try and cover in this brief talk today is essentially three things. I'm going to try and tell you something about the data and the descriptive analysis that we do. We'll document that a lot of the firms that get acquired do not have patents, but if they do, they turn out to be quite valuable. There are many repeat acquisitions that occur in the same technology space. The frequency of acquisitions is also related to more patent consolidation. And we also see a sharp drop in target employee retention after acquisitions. The two main analyses that we then do, in addition to this descriptive analysis, is a panel data analysis at the technology class level, specifically at the CPC group level, where we first show that innovation frequently precedes acquisition and that we do not really find strong evidence of killer acquisitions in tech, but rather evidence that's consistent with incumbents acquiring startups to access promising technologies. So rather than shutting them down, it's mostly about the access to these technologies. The third analysis that we do is at the patent level, and we show there that patent citations increase post-acquisition. So again, not evidence of a death of innovation. And we also show that these increases are more pronounced when there are more follow-on acquisitions and when target employee retention is low. Takeaway that I have from this paper is that acquisitions mostly serve to access promising technologies and seem to facilitate technology diffusion. There's not large-scale evidence of a killer acquisition, but I should say here that the finding that we originally had in the paper with Song and Colleen was really a very, very strong finding that said, on average, in the pharmaceutical industry, you have negative impact on innovation of these acquisitions. And that's a very, very, very strong finding, because it not just says that there are some killer acquisitions, but rather that on average, these killer acquisitions have a negative impact on innovation. We do not find this here, but that doesn't mean that there are no killer acquisitions in this space. It just means that on average, we don't find evidence of a negative impact on innovation. Additional caveat that I should give is that what we are doing is broadly interpreted about innovation, but what we're really doing is we're looking at patents. And so patents are not equal to innovation. So we're entirely subject to the looking under the lamppost critique. We're just looking where there is data here, and that's the stuff on patents. We look at cooperative patent classification. So these are CPCs, these are main groups, and these are, of course, not product markets. CPCs combine substitutes and complements, and so it's really not the right way to think about this as a specific subclass or market. Okay? And then finally, what I'm mostly going to present you with today is we have correlations. We have descriptive analysis, we have correlations, we don't have any instruments. We have a notional experiment in the sense of a policy shift versus a merger retrospective. And you could argue here, especially if you think more about the antitrust context, is that we're just documenting average effects here. Okay, and that's maybe not all that useful for looking at any special specific acquisition here. And then finally, even if we were about innovation, even if our patent analysis and our patent citation analysis would be about innovation, that wouldn't just cover all harm. It would just cover potentially innovation harm, but there is plenty of other harm that could potentially be there in these acquisitions that is not just innovation related, but is price related and related to other aspects of competition. So what we're going to do is, I already said this, is threefold. We're going to have a comprehensive empirical mapping of the acquisition behavior of 8 specific technology firms. We're going to then use the technology class level analysis of innovation before and acquisitions. And then we're going to try to look also at the knowledge spillovers at the innovation level as measured by these patent citations. And in addition, we're going to try, and this is still a little bit, I think, the stuff that is not the most polished part of the paper, we're going to try to supplement this with information about moves that occur at these companies using employee data. So let me dive into the descriptive analysis. The data sources are very simple. It's just we have a pretty time intensive, so now it maybe would not be so time intensive, but when we started this project, it was quite time intensive. All the acquisitions of Amazon, Apple, Cisco, Facebook, Google, Intel, Microsoft, and Qualcomm, because they're the focus of the innovation and antitrust policy debate in this space. We merged this in with patent data from the USPTO, and then some workforce data using resume histories from Revelio Labs, which come from LinkedIn data. Unit of analysis is going to be CPC groups by year for the technology event level studies, and then patent by year for citation dynamics and heterogeneity. If you want to know more about the particular workforce data, I can share those things too, and they'll be available on the slides that I post. So let me begin with these acquisitions. This is just the time graph basically of these acquisitions. There are 1,200 of them from 1987 to 2020. The most intense acquirers are Google, Microsoft, and Cisco. They are followed by Apple and Amazon. And as you can see, and not too surprisingly, the acquisitions are highly clustered in the late 1990s and again in the 2010s. I've also plotted here the probability of acquisitions with patents. So these are basically the percentage of firms that have patents that are getting acquired in these. The average number of the acquired patents is relatively stable. The probability of acquisitions with patents is also somewhat stable, hovers around sort of 30 to 40%. And the number of acquisitions that goes through a bit more spikes, which is essentially driven by the various M&A booms, and also very strongly driven by a zero interest rate environment in which acquisitions are particularly frequent feature. So let me go dive in a little bit more and just telling you some very, very boring, but maybe for us not so boring results, because we didn't know these things before we started this. The share of targets with at least one patent differs across these acquirers. Not too surprisingly, Qualcomm and Intel with 70 and 57% acquire firms with patents most frequently. Why is that? Well, these are hardware-focused firms. So they're not quite like the other big tech firms. Instead, they are more hardware ones. And the hardware ones, you're going to have more of these patents and more patent protection than in the software-based ones. Amazon and Facebook least frequently acquire patent targets, but even for them, they make up a sizable part of that acquisition portfolio. Conditional patenting, the portfolio sizes vary. So Intel's acquired targets average about 21 patents, Qualcomm 20, Facebook's average is fewer than 4. Again, very much consistent with the idea that there's the software acquirers and then there's the more hardware-based acquirers. What is very much true is that all of the transactions that involve targets with patents involve substantially higher mean and median deal values. So we use the median here because I think it's much more informative than the mean. That's a lot more skewed by just these very, very large acquisitions. And you can see that for across all of these acquirers, and so all across all 8 ones, you have substantially higher values for those firms with the patents than for the firms that do not have patents. On average, here the medians rise from about 100 million with no patents to about 259 million with patents. Let me give you an example of these. So this is not one that I think is in any way a killer acquisition, but I think illustrates very, very clearly the types of acquisitions that we see in this space. And what we see here is that this is WIM Labs that got acquired by Google. It was founded in 2010. It's one of the first startups to build a wearable smartwatch platform. Okay? It's launched its first device in 2011. Their business model was really a clear one. We're not going to build our own watch on this, but instead what we're going to do is we're going to use our technology and license it out to some consumer-facing tech companies. And then what Google did is they silently acquired WIM Labs in 2012. What I mean by silently is there's no big fanfare about this. So you'd have trouble finding this acquisition because it's relatively small. It's not something that is big reported by Google, but we have it in our data. At the time of acquisition, WIM Labs owned 10 patents on the user interface, on the touch screen, and on file sharing between devices. And the patents that they have, these 10 patents, covered 6 different CPC main groups. So these CPC main groups, 2 examples of those are input arrangements for transferring data to be processed into a form capable of being handled by the computer, or services specially adapted for wireless communication networks. So they are relatively tight and relatively narrow CPC groups that we're using here. We're really using the lowest possible level. We're not aggregating up to higher groups, but rather we're going really to the most fine-grained level here of the CPC group. The acquired patent CPC codes. So what we're going to do here is we're restricting the sample to CPC sections G and H, okay, that cover most of digital tech. If we include other ones, it doesn't really change the results, but we want to have a nice comparison across the different ones. So we're sticking to section G and H. And then we want to see, okay, how often, okay, and you have to interpret this now with some care. It's like how often are CPC codes treated? And what do we mean by that? Treatment here means that there's an acquisition of a firm that holds patents in this particular CPC group that gets acquired by one of these 8 acquirers. Okay? And so 303 out of the roughly 1,200 CPC codes in G and H here are treated at least once. Okay? And so that means we have about 38% single acquisition events, and then we have 62% multiple events, okay, of those 303. So what does multiple events mean? It means that there are several acquisitions of perhaps sometimes the same acquirer again, acquiring another company with patents in that CPC group, or another big tech acquirer acquiring companies in that particular CPC group. The heterogeneity that we're particularly interested in, and I should say this here, the reason for this is that these repeat acquisitions have been particularly flagged by antitrust authorities in the past, you know, in the form of roll-ups in various other spaces. So there's even a specific guideline now in the merger guidelines that asks to investigate specifically these repeat acquisitions in markets. Now, the markets that we have are technology markets, and so we're treating essentially how often does it happen that we have these repeat acquisitions. So do they happen over and over again in the same CPC group? We have a follow-on likelihood that differs quite substantially by acquirer, and you can see that for each one of these firms here, there's a different amount of follow-on acquisitions. So again, another acquisitions by that acquirer in that same space, okay? And that is relatively large and is also not too surprisingly now driven by the acquirer owning patents in this before. So there seems to be some kind of specialization. You're more likely again to acquire in a CPC group if you already own patents in this space before, perhaps because you bought some stuff in this before, or you actually did some innovation on this before. We have not yet disentangled those 2 effects because we don't actually know whether some of the patents that are held by Google came into being acquired beforehand or not, but we're working on that. On these repeat acquisitions, something that has been also flagged again, how much consolidation does this lead? Now, usually we worry about consolidation of assets. Here we're going to say, okay, we don't know anything about the assets specifically, but we can say something about consolidation of the patents in this space. So what we're going to do is we're going to try and see within a treated CPC group, what is the share of patents owned by big tech, okay, combined. So how much is owned by all of these 8 companies, okay, when we have these acquisitions. And unsurprisingly, as you have more and more acquisitions, so this is the number of acquisitions by these big tech companies in a particular CPC code, what happens to the share of patents owned by big tech in that particular CPC group? And you can see that's very much trending upwards. The more acquisitions there are by big tech companies, the more the share of the patents also tends to be concentrated. And that's obviously also true, not just when I include the target patents, so the ones that are acquired here, but also if I exclude the target patents. So there seems to be some consolidation. It's not massive, I'd say. Okay, it starts off initially by the first acquisition, there's somewhat a share of around just below 5%. Okay, once we have 15, which is of course a high, big outlier here, okay, you go up to 15. But as you have like 5, you about double the, if you have about 5 of these acquisitions, you about double the share of the patent share. But if I were to put my antitrust policy hat on, is I usually don't worry about, you know, shares or ownership that's around the 5% mark. That's not something that is really all that negative. Second heterogeneity dimension that we look at is the employee retention. Okay, so this is looking at the retention for target employees. And we find that that drops sharply at acquisition. Okay, about 40% of target employees, so these are employees at the target company, 40% of those leave within 1 year after the deal. By 3 years, the cumulative attrition exceeds 50%. Okay? Again, there's a huge amount of variation across the different acquirers. Okay? And so we see actually that's much bigger, this variation in retention across the acquirers, than the variation in retention across the acquirers is not that different. But what is really different is how much that varies by the different targets. They all are somewhat similar, so 50%, 53%, 39%, 42% is around all that ballpark of what happens 3 years after the acquisition. We find the full range of retention rates. So sometimes it's 0 and sometimes it's 1 for all the big tech companies except for Amazon. Amazon actually has the least amount of variation there. It's 39%, but the variation around it is actually not all that big. The retention gap, and here we do a thing that I think we can still improve on, which is we look at how much retention is there between the different firms that get acquired, and try to compare this to similar employees. Okay, and so when I say here retention acquihire, these are our acquisitions that occur here. So you buy the company, your big tech company, you buy this company, how much retention do we have after year 1, year 2, year 3, and so on. And then we're going to look at this to similar employees that have very similar CVs, in a sense of similar descriptions at the acquiring company, and check how many of these people remain. So this is a comparison of similar employees at the acquiring company versus the one that got acquired, okay, which is the blue line. And the blue line is everywhere below that red line. But one thing that we want to do now, still in addition, is that, you know, maybe there's a better set of comparisons that we can do. What does the retention look like for these acquired ones, or these big tech acquisitions of these smaller companies? How different is that from the retention rates of startups in general? Okay, and so rather than trying to match employees between target and acquirer, what about if we just compare them more broadly against other startups? Okay, Cisco again has the smallest retention gap, but it's relatively otherwise the pattern is very broad-based across all the acquirers, that there's a big difference between the red line and the blue line, so that the inside employees and the newly acquired employees. All right, let me now go into the CPC group level analysis, okay, where we're going to try and look at the patent level, at the CPC level, and see what does this do to patents when there's an acquisition in a particular CPC group. Okay? So specifically what we're asking, how does patenting in CPC, how is that associated with an acquisition, okay, relative to other CPCs that are similar. Okay, so we're going to do some kind of matching here. We're going to try and compare CPC groups that are similar to the ones that are being treated. And of course, there's, immediately all of your selection bias alarm bells should go off. Okay, and that's exactly what we want you to think about, that there's a huge amount of selection potentially going on, that these firms are acquiring potentially hot areas. Okay, so what we're going to do is arcsign transformed share of patents filed in a CPC group in year T, and then we do a baseline event study around the first acquisition within a CPC group with CPC group fixed effects and year fixed effects, and when you have a big event window from -10 to 10 years before. To identify the breaks in innovation trends, we also match the treated CPC groups to control CPC groups with similar pre-trends and levels. Okay? But again, that's matching, and there's a bunch of stuff that goes on here that we can't really properly make it now a like comparison. Okay, but let me show you first what we find here, which is that this is the left graph is essentially just the without matching the CPC groups all that much. And there you can just see there's massive pre-trend here. Yeah. There's a huge innovation pre-trend for the year before the acquisition. Yeah. And then when we try and sort of match the innovation pre-trends across the CPC groups, okay, we want to essentially look at, okay, is there a break in this trend when we control for that initial innovation pre-trend? So we're comparing now, we're matching CPC groups based on their level of patenting and their trend in the growth of the patenting between the treated ones and the untreated ones, in a sense. Okay, and then this matched event study looks something like this, okay, where we now don't have, by definition, in a sense, because we're matching quite well an innovation pre-trend, okay, but we still have the upward trend afterwards. Okay, now again, one should be extremely careful about how to interpret this. You should not interpret this as, oh, there's this acquisition, okay, and now innovation takes off and there's a lot more patenting that's happening, okay, because of that. That would be the wrong thing to take away from this, okay. I'll give you more interpretation in a second, okay. I want to still comment on the innovation pre-trend, is that this is also evidence that there's clearly a selection going on, okay, that innovation is preceding some form of acquisition, that the particular acquisitions are targeting CPC groups that are hot, that are innovating a lot, where there's a lot of activity, and that's also what's causing that initial pre-trend there. Okay. Now, so the innovation increases after first acquisition within a CPC group. Okay, so that's basically the takeaway from this slide here. But then we also want to see, okay, well, the reason why this trend post the acquisition is positive could very well be because there are additional acquisitions occurring. Okay, so just like you have a pre-trend for the first acquisition, okay, you might then say, okay, well, these additional acquisitions is that more companies are piling in here, okay, precisely because they understand that there is even more innovation that's going to happen in the future. It's just happening right now. We're going to see the patenting is success and outcomes of exactly in this particular CPC group later, and we're all trying to get in on that. Okay? And so what we're doing here is we're going to again think about, okay, what can we look at in terms of follow-on acquisition? So we have the first acquisition, that's where the dashed line occurs essentially, okay? And then we're going to see, okay, what happens afterwards. Okay? What happens with 1 or 2 follow-on acquisitions, and what happens with 3 or more follow-on acquisitions. And you can see that essentially fans out, that you get actually more of this upward trend here that's driven again by additional acquisitions that are happening here in this particular CPC group. Interestingly, and that's not significant, but you have a slight downward trend without any follow-on acquisitions. Okay? And so there isn't anything really exciting happening. If anything, potentially something negative is happening in that there's a decline in innovation or a decline in patenting when there's no follow-on acquisitions. Okay? So the takeaway that we have here from this is that only is if CPC groups experience more follow-on acquisitions do we really see this post-acquisition positive trend. So one thing that is similarly related without the follow-on acquisition is then to check, okay, what happens if to the last acquisition in the CPC group. So this is look at all the acquisitions that occurred in the CPC group by the big tech ones. Let's just look at the last one. Okay, does that one have any type of, does that generate any type of break in the series? And that doesn't look that way. It looks pretty flat before and looks pretty flat afterwards. So it's really this intensity, these additional acquisitions. That's what's causing, with caveats here that this is not really causing it, but that's what's really leading to this upward trend. So there's no further increases after the last acquisition of a sequence here in these CPC groups. Okay? So let me just take stock a little bit here and just say the following things. Our analysis suggests so far that innovation precedes acquisition and it's not the other way around. Okay? And that two, the big tech firms seem to acquire innovative startups to access promising technologies. The whole thing that we're finding so far is inconsistent with some strawman hypotheses. Again, I really want to emphasize here, strawman hypothesis is we don't seem to find here a substantial number of killer acquisitions, in the sense is that we don't have large-scale evidence of average effects that are negative, okay, for innovation. So it's not something that we found, and which now that I have a better appreciation of that original paper that I wrote with Colleen and Song, is that what we found there was really that there was an acquisition, okay, and that on average you had a negative effect, okay, and that is a really, really, really strong finding. That is not the case here in the tech sector, okay, and we also don't find that acquisitions are trailing technology diffusion here, okay, and so that's not what's instead is really happening is this innovation precedes the acquisition and it's not the other way around. Let me now go to the patent level evidence. So this is stuff at the CPC group level, and the way you can interpret this is saying like what happens in a particular technology area after an acquisition by a big tech company. Okay, now let's go and ask here, what happens to the patents that get acquired as part of these acquisitions? Okay? So we're going to do basically an answer to the following question: how does the citation rate of the acquired patents evolve compared to other patents in the same CPC? So now zeroing in previously with and the unit of analysis was the entire CPC group. Now we're going to say, okay, within that CPC group, some patents are going to get acquired as part of the acquisition, and some patents are not going to get acquired. And again, you should say, wait a second, selection effect here, okay? Which is maybe really the most useful patents are going to get acquired, because we're picking winners here. We're acquiring companies that are the most innovative, and they're going to have the best patents, and maybe then we're going to see particularly big effects, okay? So what we're going to look for is these forward citations to the focal patent, and we're going to use a well-trodden estimation strategy that was pioneered by my co-author Tim Simcoe together with Mark Reisman. We're going to do just a simple diff and diff of what is this effect of the post-acquisition, okay, on the citations, okay, with various CPC plus year fixed effects and patent fixed effects, okay, as well as patent age profiles, quadratic and cubic, okay, to take out a bit of the noise. Okay. So here's what this looks like. Okay. This is the forward citations now to target patents, okay, before and after the acquisition. Okay? And again, we have a little bit of a pre-trend here. The reason for that particular pre-trend comes from the issue that there's a distinction here, and I think we're the first one to document this in terms of application year and grant year counts for the citations. Okay, and so what we're showing you here, this is the application year. Okay, and The grant year one maybe is actually a slightly better version of this, okay, and that one does not have that initial pre-trend. Okay, so the forward citations to the target patents increase after the acquisition, and they increase quite substantially. They go up sort of like a patent per, you get a change of about an additional site per year to the patent, okay, which if you've ever worked with patents, is actually quite a large number. Okay? And so that this is not small. One, it sounds like one citation is not very much, but it's actually a fairly large number. Okay? Now we're going to do the same thing as before. I'm going to say, okay, does it make a difference if you have these follow-on acquisitions? Okay, so we're going to try and see what if we have acquisitions with and without follow-on acquisitions? Are we going to see similar fanning out? Okay. And then we're also going to do the second thing, which is we're going to try and see, is it related in any way to the post-acquisition employee retention? So when you have more of these employees staying or going out to other firms, does that change in any way the citation rate of these patents that were acquired as part of these acquisitions? Okay? And so let me show you a little bit of this here. It turns out that when we have more of these follow-ons, okay, you get more of the citations again. So if you get the citations increase by about 1, okay, following the acquisition, because that's the 1.13, okay, and they're particularly also when you then have follow-on ones. Okay? And so that's the second column here, that you get more of these citations when there's more follow-on acquisitions. Again, consistent with what we found also originally in that CPC group analysis. Okay. And the third column is then trying to see, okay, is this in any way related to retention? And there's, I'd say, a very somewhat of an effect there. Okay, so it's significant at the 5% level, but again, you should interpret this with some caution, because this is again not randomly assigned. We're not randomly assigning retention. We're not randomly assigning acquisition. But it seems that actually you have more citations, okay, if you have less retention. So which is maybe consistent with this type of story, that if your employees that you acquired as part of the acquisition all go out and work for other companies now are following the acquisition, then maybe this is the reason why a bunch of these patents are getting cited, because now they're getting diffused. The knowledge about this is getting diffused outside to the outside world. Now, what we're working on at the moment is to see whether that is actually linked to the identity of the people who are leaving. At the moment, what we have here is just, if you have more people that are being retained, okay, and we're just splitting the sample half here, yeah, then you get fewer of these citations. Okay? If many of these go out in the world, then there's actually more citations. But we haven't specifically pinpointed and said, okay, it's the ones that are leaving at the new companies, they're the ones that are also citing this, okay, which I think would be then very much consistent with this idea that we're specifically sort of identifying the mechanisms through which retention and citations following acquisitions are related. Okay, one last thing that we also then do is we decompose the forward citations by source. So is it just that the citations are coming just from the acquirer, that they acquire this and now they cite this like crazy? It turns out no, it's happening both at the acquirer and the acquired targets, as well as by other firms. Okay? The post-acquisitions increases a presence for both, but there's actually larger growth from third parties in most specifications. And that seems to be somewhat consistent with both internal knowledge integration and broader spillovers throughout these CPC groups. Okay? We also have a bunch of robustness stuff. So we do application year versus grant year citation counts, where we exclude self-citations, where we have alternative normalizations by CPC activities. Most of the coefficients are pretty stable across specifications, and are in line with positive and economically meaningful post-acquisition increases in forward citations. Okay? And again, I think here, you shouldn't think of this necessarily just as a causal effect, but maybe evidence that something is going on that is actually somewhat beneficial, okay, following these acquisitions. Okay, again, not evidence of some really, really negative results here. Okay? So let me conclude here and say the following: we construct this big database of 1,200 acquisitions by 8 major technology firms since the late 1980s. The acquired targets do not have patents, but involve deals that are significantly larger in value. They're followed by increases in patenting, especially when they're repeated acquisitions. Okay? The employee retention is limited, but sometimes actually allows for innovation to diffuse faster. So my takeaway from all of this is that big tech acquisitions can actually accelerate knowledge diffusion. We do not find large-scale evidence of negative effects on innovation, but the impacts are, of course, very heterogeneous across firms, technologies, and acquisition sequences. If one were to really worry about this and think harder about how does this influence antitrust policy, then we should think more about innovation-centric guidelines that don't just think about market shares in the product market, or don't just think about stuff that is very much focused on the outcomes, but rather also thinks about more about stuff about patenting, and maybe specifically incorporates that in the merger review process. Okay, with that, I'm finished, and I'm very much looking forward to the discussion by Merih and any additional questions you might have.
Thank you very much, Florian. So, Merih, the floor is yours, and you have 15 minutes.
Okay, perfect. Can you see my slides? Yes, so thank you very much, Camille, Melanie, Mike, and Song, for this opportunity. I mean, this is a career highlight almost for me, because in 2018, I discussed Florian's paper at the Florida State University's conference. And I mean, it influenced my thinking a lot, even though I must say I didn't believe in the killer acquisition story 100%. My comments were, this is an amazing paper, which got into an amazing journal later, but I was not 100% convinced about, some drugs projects being terminated. Now, 7.5 years later, I mean, it's amazing that I see Florian coming up with this paper and saying, maybe outside that industry, killer acquisitions are not happening, or, that's not what we observe. And it is very progressive. I mean, this is how research should be done. And I love the fact that, it's the same person who wrote the paper, JP paper, and this paper. So very, very special opportunity today for me. And I must say that, Florian, I am really a good discussant for this paper, because your original paper influenced my thinking a lot. I talked to a lot of colleagues, PhD students, everybody about killer acquisitions since I got to learn from your paper. And I mean, there is no other literature that I followed that closely, probably in the last 7 years. So I read hundreds of papers and refereed hundreds of papers. So it's good news because I am very informed. I mean, it's less good news because the bar is a bit high now for this literature, to make a contribution, because I mean, it is kind of your fault, because you generated this, you initiated this literature, and people found it so interesting that a lot of research has been done since your paper. So to start off my discussion, I mean, I love the research question and I love your paper, but given all these papers that we wrote, especially in finance, right? So it is a bit, I mean, I need to see a little bit more from you how we are relating to all these papers. And this is a very short list. This list can go on and on and on. And I mean, for economists and financial economists like me, we have a great opportunity to bridge the gap when we research similar topics, because I didn't see these papers cited in your paper. And I mean, I don't know the papers that you are citing, because you are coming more from the econ perspective, and these are more the finance papers. So I think it's our job, responsibility to kind of first bridge these literatures. But let me tell you, let me try to explain how I see your paper within kind of this existing literature, right? So Gordon Phillips and his co-author Alexis Zidanov, they wrote a paper early, like more than 10 years ago, early 2010s, And they said, large firms acquire innovation from outside because small firms, maybe startups, are more efficient in innovating. Right. So then large firms have deep pockets, financial resources. They would buy innovation, they would commercialize it. So that's kind of one of the first papers. Then Amit Seru's job market paper came, and I mean, I don't know the sequence. Maybe he wrote it before Gordon Phillips, but this is the publication timeline. And he said, firms acquire a lot of innovation patents. And M&A serves a big role in terms of like bringing patents inside a firm, outside firm boundaries. And he said, if the firm is very large and there are a lot of internal capital markets and agency problems, inventors become less kind of productive, and those acquisitions don't work very well. But I mean, it is one of the papers that looked at the role of M&A in bringing innovation inside the firm. Then Benai and Lee, they wrote a paper, it's in JF now, which said pretty much the same thing that you are saying, I think, because they said, firms acquire innovation, and the more actually innovative acquiring firms are, the more patents they will generate in the future, and the more these new patents will generate citations. Right. So again, I mean, it is very similar to what you are saying, even though methodologically, empirical methodology is different. Then Lee and Wang wrote another paper. They said, again, firms acquire or merge because that's a way to bring inventors from the target firm and the acquiring firm. We bring these inventors like co-authors almost, and they work together after the acquisition, and they generate great patents. And I actually discussed the first paper. I discussed the third paper. So because, I mean, this is a very important literature for me. And I had my own paper written at the same time as Benai and Lee, more than 10 years old now. So we are almost submitting it back to RCFS soon. But we look at more like the valuation effects, like you were saying, more innovative firms acquire patents. So we have that result, and they pay more for targets with patents. Transaction values are higher, and the market reacts really positively when you acquire a startup or a firm with existing patents, because market likes this innovation. Right. So, I mean, these are just a tiny set of the existing literature. This literature is huge. So then I kind of summarize these punchlines from these papers. Large firms acquire innovation because small firms are better, and large firms are not that good, not that efficient. Acquirers innovate more after acquiring patents because they learn from them, and then acquirers acquire patents, and because they are less financially constrained than targets, they commercialize them into new products. And then we acquire inventors. Inventors collaborate after acquisitions. And so I talked about the other things. So your paper, I mean, the way I see it is saying something similar, even though, I mean, there is no causality, or you are not making a claim that acquisitions increase innovation or patents in a given technological domain. Although in certain parts of the paper, I mean, it is implied a little bit that, acquisitions increase innovation, right? And then also very novel part in your paper, I think this, I loved it, and I didn't see this result in other papers. After acquisitions, a lot of inventors leave because they like startups. They don't like big bureaucratic firms. That result is there. But then maybe that's a great mechanism for diffusion of innovation, right? Because when we look at acquired patents and their future citations, they get citations from the acquiring firm as well as from outside firms. I mean, I love that. That's a very good that's a very interesting finding, because it also relates to business dynamism and how declining business dynamism is very bad for innovation, because I mean, if people are not moving from one firm to another and their knowledge is kind of stuck within the same firm, other firms or other people are not learning from them. So I love that result. Maybe that's a way to push the paper or use that to position the paper within the existing literature. So I mean, like reading your paper, right? Acquisitions don't seem to play a role, right? Because acquisition, it's more like a selection story, even though you never claimed, you were proposing treatment or anything, right? I mean, it says, okay, there is this innovation boom in a technological domain, and we see a lot of firms acquiring patents in that technological domain, but also these firms are not uninformed buyers. They did innovation on their own. They are like informed buyers. They are not subject to adverse selection. So they buy new patents, and then we see more patents in that technological domain. I mean, very interesting, but it's not clear what is causing what and what is the role, special role for acquisitions. Right, so that's a little bit of a black box for me. And I would like you to maybe tell us a little bit more what is the role of acquisitions, and I will come back to that. And also in the beginning of your presentation, you talked about like the startup exits, right? Because startups, again, in your paper, it's not very well defined what is a startup is. Is it coming from Crunchbase or PitchBook? Is it a VC-backed startup, or is it a small firm with patents? So I didn't see any of those definitions. But I mean, in finance, we say, okay, there are a lot of startups, right? 90% of them get acquired. That's an exit channel for them. 10% do an IPO. And this M&A exit channel is very important because if I'm a startup founder, I'm selling my startup to Microsoft. I get 50 million euros or dollars and I start a new firm, right? But then that is exactly maybe why innovation is increasing, right, in that technological domain. So are you telling us that M&A exit story? If you are saying that, I mean, Gordon Phillips is also very active in these literatures. He wrote and he published a new paper and he said, as we observe more venture capital-backed startups, there are more M&A activity later because M&A is a way to buy these startups and redirect the innovation capital in those startups to new innovations, right? So is your paper making that point or a point similar to that paper? Or again, I mean, are we just capturing selection? Or is the acquiring firm bringing some capabilities, some innovation? So I think it would be very important to differentiate or tell us more why we are talking about M&A here. And this becomes more important for me because I mean, you observe that there is an increase in that technological domain, right? But somebody must be innovating. I mean, who is generating these new patents? Is it like some agents, some startups which have nothing to do with the acquired startup? Or is it the acquired startup becoming more productive within the acquired company? Is it the acquirer firm's inventors, or are they together becoming more productive and generating more innovation? Or we are releasing the inventors from the target firm to new startups. I mean, it's really important for me to understand what explains that surge in innovation after I observe an acquisition in a technological domain. And yes, I talked about it. So this part, I love it because I mean, I have been thinking a lot about this. There is no paper on this, but there is a very similar paper though, which looks at acquisitions of startups, right? This is a strategic management journal paper. He's at Wharton. So he uses census data and he looks at acquirer firms buying startups and then tracks employees of these startups relative to, like similar to what you are doing, relative to employees of the acquiring firm, but not employees who have been there for 10 years, employees or inventors who are hired from the outside labor market. And he finds that there's a huge rate of employee departures after startup acquisitions. I mean, he doesn't talk about knowledge diffusion or citations, but this idea that startups, I mean, generate a technology, they sell it to one of the digital firms or Magnificent Seven, NVIDIA or Microsoft, and then they get the money and they do their next thing, is very well known and very well established. I mean, is it one of your punchlines? And are you kind of linking that to citations? I mean, that's very interesting, very novel, but again, to me, it's not clear what is the most important finding or the punchline here. So I would definitely push this forward. And again, you are not telling us, I mean, where these departing employees are going, right? Are they joining, like they are selling to Microsoft and they are joining Google, or are they starting a startup, or are they going to a university and then they are becoming professors? I mean, and it is very hard to say something about these employees. I will come to that because, I mean, data limitations are very severe, right? But then coming back to this comment about what is like specific about or special about M&A, because I can tell this story about IPOs. Actually, people already said it, but let's say, I mean, I am writing your paper about IPOs. I say, okay, when a firm goes public, right? I mean, Shai Bernstein already made this point.
Merih,
A
do you
lot
have
of,
to
yeah.
conclude in 1 or 2 minutes? Like,
Okay.
because we're gonna
Okay.
out of time.
So
Thank
I
you.
mean, IPOs could, like, if I replace M&A here with IPOs, it's gonna work. It's gonna go through because IPOs get a lot of capital. People leave, especially inventors leave. They join new startups. There is more innovation. So then, I mean, why can't I write a paper about IPOs? So that is another reason why we need to understand the special role of M&A. And my last comment is, I mean, I love what you are doing, but I don't understand exactly how with Revelio Labs data, we are able to track all these employees of Facebook and Microsoft, given that Microsoft has more than 200,000 employees, right? Inventors, yes, but employees of the acquiring firm, impossible to track because, I mean, Revelio Labs gets the data from LinkedIn unless somebody uses census data or administrative data in Europe. Right? That's why all these papers are done with census data in the US. I mean, you need to give us a little bit more information about your data source on Revelio Labs, to what extent I am capturing, observing, or tracking employees of acquiring and the target firm. And to conclude, I mean, there can't be any other topic more important than this, right? For policy, for research, I love that. But I mean, we have to bridge this gap between econ literatures and finance literatures. There is so much in the finance literature. I didn't see them in your paper. Otherwise, it would be very hard, I think, for us to understand what we are learning relative to what we learn from that literature. And also, I mean, I have to learn your literatures as well. It's not one-sided. Yeah, so this is all I have. Thank you very much again. I very much enjoyed reading it, thinking about it, and learning from it. Thanks.